I heard it clearly, though she hadn't meant for me to. My daughter-in-law's voice was soft, almost as if she were leaning in to speak to her friend rather than to the man I once held as a baby. No photos with her. Just those 4 words, sharp as the crack of ice in a glass of water. The waiter stood nearby, waiting to snap the group picture, his polite smile frozen in place, and for a moment I thought I must have imagined it. But the way my son's eyes darted to mine, then quickly away, confirmed I had not. He didn't correct her. He didn't protest. He simply placed his arm around her shoulder and looked at the waiter as if the matter were settled. I lifted my glass then, not to toast or to smile, but to shield my trembling lips. One moment, I said to the waiter, as if I needed a breath to compose myself before the flash. The glass felt heavier than usual, though it was only half full. My birthday dinner, at my favorite steakhouse no less, was supposed to feel like a gathering of love. Instead, the words rang in my ears, steady and merciless. No photos with her. It's strange how quickly a single phrase can redraw the lines of belonging. Only a few seconds earlier, I had been laughing with the waiter about whether I could finish the dessert they brought with the little candle stuck inside. I had even felt a quiet pride that my son had organized this dinner at all, since the years had made such gatherings rarer. Now, though, I was no longer sure if the seat I occupied was even mine. I took another sip, letting the cool bitterness of the red wine anchor me. Around me, voices rose in cheerful chatter, knives scraped against plates, and my grandchildren played with straws and napkins at the end of the table. Yet in the center of all that noise, I felt a hollow ring. My son's wife had dismissed me as easily as someone might brush away a crumb. I didn't say anything then. I smiled when the camera clicked, though I noticed the way she leaned slightly forward, her shoulder obstructing me. I smiled when the waiter promised to print the photos and deliver them to the table. I even smiled when my grandson whispered that he wanted me to help him with his coloring book once we got back to the house. But inside, something was shifting. It was small, like the first crack in a plate you don't notice until the chip grows larger. When the cake was finally brought out, rich chocolate, far too sweet for my taste, I closed my eyes and made a wish. I didn't wish for health or money or even love. I wished for clarity. I wished to know what it was that made me unwanted in their pictures, in their story, in their family. And if I couldn't know, I wished for the strength to live with not knowing. After the candles were blown and the slices passed around, I excused myself for a walk outside. The evening air was cool, and the neon steakhouse sign buzzed faintly above the parking lot. I wrapped my coat tighter, wishing I had brought a scarf. The laughter inside carried through the glass windows, and I realized with a dull certainty that I wasn't missed. Not at that moment, not in that glow. The truth is, I have always been an outsider in my son's marriage. From the beginning, his wife kept a polite distance. Never rude, not exactly, but cool, like a guest who stays only long enough to finish her tea. She never called me mom or even mother-in-law. Always my first name, clipped and cautious. I told myself that was fine, that not everyone grew up with words of affection, that it didn't mean rejection. But over time, the distance hardened into something I could no longer soften with excuses. Invitations to birthdays for the children sometimes came late, sometimes not at all. Holidays were spent with her family, always with explanations about scheduling conflicts. And when I was invited, there was always the sense that I had been added as an afterthought. Still, I had convinced myself that tonight was different. My birthday, surely that would matter. Surely my son, who once held my hand so tightly in grocery stores, would make sure I was at the center, if only for an evening. And yet there I was, told in so many words that my face was not wanted in their memories. I leaned against the brick wall outside the restaurant, staring at the cars moving slowly down the boulevard. I remembered birthdays from long ago, when I was the one baking cakes and stringing balloons, when my son's face lit up as soon as he saw the presents I had stayed up late wrapping. I had saved every photo back then, his toothless grins, his messy hair, his wide-eyed excitement. And now, decades later, his wife was saying I didn't belong in the photos at all. When I returned to the table, I noticed the envelope with the printed pictures lying beside my son. He slid them quickly into his wife's purse, not offering them around as one might usually do. I caught his eye, just for a second, and I saw the shame there. But he said nothing. That silence, more than her words, cut the deepest. The rest of the dinner passed in fragments. Polite laughter. Small talk about work. Questions to the grandchildren about school. I played my part. I passed the salt, complimented the steak, asked if anyone wanted more bread. But all the while, a quiet resolve was forming in me. When we finally left, I hugged my grandchildren tightly, breathing in their warmth, storing it like a secret. My son kissed my cheek distractedly, already turning to help his wife with her coat. I walked to my car alone, the night cool on my face. Before starting the engine, I sat for a long time in the dark, the steering wheel cold beneath my fingers. No photos with her. I whispered the words out loud, testing how they sounded in my own voice. They were harsher spoken than when I had heard them. They were final, like a door closing. And in that parking lot, I realized that perhaps it was time I closed a door of my own. Not in anger, but in protection of whatever dignity I still had left. I drove home slowly, the lights of the city blurring slightly as tears pressed against my eyes. But I did not cry. Not fully. Instead, I let the sadness sit beside me like an old companion, quiet and heavy, and I spoke to it as if it could hear me. "We'll be all right," I said. "We'll find a way." Inside my house, I set down my purse, hung up my coat, and placed the unopened card from my son on the mantel. I didn't read it. Not that night. Maybe not ever. Instead, I poured myself a small glass of water, sat at the kitchen table, and listened to the silence. It was then I made a decision, not all at once, not in some dramatic declaration, but in the small, firm way one decides to finally throw out a worn-out sweater. I would no longer wait for their acceptance. I would no longer hope to be placed in their pictures. Instead, I would begin making my own. My own memories, my own moments, my own proof that I had lived and mattered, whether or not they chose to see it. I sat there for a long while, the night pressing gently against the windows, until the house itself seemed to breathe with me. And for the first time in years, I felt the faint stir of something I had almost forgotten: freedom. The morning after my birthday, I woke to the faint sound of birdsong outside my window, though for a while I lay still, staring at the ceiling, not yet ready to rise. The house felt unusually quiet, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened the night before. I thought about the unopened card on the mantel, about the envelope of photos that had vanished into my daughter-in-law's purse, about the words that had burrowed into me like thorns: no photos with her. I brewed coffee as I always did, 2 scoops, water to the line, the same chipped blue mug I've had for years, but even the smell of it failed to comfort me. I sat at the table, wrapping my hands around the warmth, and felt the hollowness of routine. It struck me then how often I had waited for scraps of affection, how often I had convinced myself that being tolerated was close enough to being loved. Perhaps that is the way some mothers age, slowly shrinking themselves to fit the spaces their children allow. But something had shifted. It wasn't a dramatic revolution, not yet. It was more like the sound of a drawer quietly sliding shut inside my chest. I told myself I couldn't undo what had been said, but I could decide how to move forward. And so, I began small. I put on my shoes and walked down to the bakery at the corner. The air was brisk, carrying the faint scent of autumn leaves, and the pavement glistened faintly from a night of rain. As I walked, I noticed things I had not in years: the red bricks that had begun to crumble along the old church wall, the way the morning light pooled like honey on the steps of the library, the rustle of sparrows darting between hedges. Life was still happening, still unfolding, with or without my son's approval. At the bakery, I bought myself a croissant, still warm, and sat near the window with my coffee. I had never done this alone before. It always seemed indulgent, something one did with friends or family. But there I was, tearing off pieces of buttery pastry, watching the morning traffic, and realizing that solitude need not mean loneliness. When I returned home, I dug out the old photo albums from the closet. They were heavy, their spines worn, filled with snapshots from years gone by: birthdays, school plays, vacations at the lake. There I was, smiling broadly, my son's arms around my neck, his childhood joy radiating from every page. I lingered on those pictures, tracing the glossy surface with my fingertips, almost as if touching them might pull me back to the days when I was indispensable. And then I thought of the irony, how those moments I had so carefully preserved were now unwelcome in their own family's record. It hurt. It burned in places I hadn't known could ache. But it also lit a strange resolve in me. If I was to be erased from their narrative, then I would create one of my own. I closed the albums and placed them gently on the table. Then I fetched my old camera from the drawer. It had gathered dust over the years, but when I switched it on, the lens whirred obediently. I began with the simplest things, the steam curling from my morning cup, the vase of wilting daisies on the counter, the shadow of the windowpane stretched across the floor. Each click of the shutter was a small declaration, I am here. I exist. My story matters. The days that followed unfolded slowly, each one a cautious step away from dependence and toward something I could not yet name. I went to the farmer's market on Saturday, alone, and bought a bundle of sunflowers so bright they seemed almost defiant. I placed them in a jar by the window, and for the first time in years, my house felt alive. Of course, there were moments of weakness. In the evenings, I sometimes stared at the phone, waiting for it to ring, for my son to call and say he was sorry, that it had all been a misunderstanding. But the call never came. Instead, silence stretched like a river between us, and I realized I could either drown in it or learn to build my own bridge across. One Sunday afternoon, I drove to the park. Families gathered on the grass with picnic baskets, children squealed on the swings, couples strolled hand in hand. I sat on a bench, watching it all, feeling at once invisible and oddly liberated. A little girl, no older than 5, chased a butterfly near my feet. She laughed when it landed on the bench beside me. "You're lucky," she said, wide-eyed. "It likes you." I smiled, and for a fleeting second, I felt seen, not as someone excluded, but simply as a person worthy of joy. It was after that day that I began carrying my camera everywhere. I photographed the world as if I were reclaiming it piece by piece. The crooked fence in my neighbor's yard. The elderly man who fed pigeons every morning by the fountain. The blaze of orange sky at sunset that made the rooftops look aflame. Each picture became proof that my life extended beyond the narrow space I had been pushed into. But healing is never linear. One evening, while sorting through the photographs on my table, I came across an old one that had slipped loose from the albums. It was of my son, maybe 7 or 8, his cheeks flushed from running, holding a slice of birthday cake with both hands. I remembered that day vividly, how he had begged me for a dinosaur cake, how I had stayed up past midnight sculpting green icing into clumsy little spikes. The joy on his face had made every moment worthwhile. Seeing that photo now, decades later, I felt the tears finally spill. They came quietly, no sobbing, just a steady stream, as if my body had decided it was safe to grieve. I didn't fight it. I let the grief wash through me, knowing it was part of the journey. When the tears dried, I looked again at the photograph and thought, perhaps love does not vanish, even if it is not returned. Perhaps it simply changes form, like water finding new paths through the earth. That night, I placed the photo on my bedside table, not as a reminder of loss, but as a testament to love that had once been true. And I whispered, as though my son could somehow hear me across the miles of silence, "I will always love you. But I must also learn to love myself." In the weeks that followed, I began seeking out new rhythms. I joined a local book club, something I had always been too shy to do. I found myself laughing with strangers about characters and plots, my voice less tentative with each meeting. I attended a yoga class at the community center, though my stiff joints protested, and afterward I shared tea with a woman who spoke warmly about her travels. Piece by piece, I was weaving a life that no longer hinged on being accepted into one family's narrative. And yet, late at night, when the house was quiet and the world outside lay dark, the words still returned, "No photos with her." They echoed not as cruelty alone, but as a kind of liberation too. Because in being excluded, I was given permission to stop waiting. And with that freedom, however painful, came the chance to begin again. One Saturday morning, I walked to the antique shop on the corner. A pale blue scarf caught my eye, silk, soft, with delicate frayed edges. It reminded me of the scarves my mother used to wear when she wanted to feel elegant. I bought it without hesitation, wrapped it around my shoulders, and felt, for the first time in years, like a woman who still had places to go. That afternoon, I drove out of town to the lake where we had once spent summers as a family. The cabins were older now, some collapsing, the pier missing boards. But the water sparkled as it always had, and the trees whispered in the breeze. I sat by the shore, wrapped in my new scarf, and took photographs until the sun dipped low. When I looked at the images later, I saw not just the lake but myself reflected in its calm, still here, still whole, still alive. It struck me then, perhaps I did not need to erase the pain or demand apology. Perhaps my task was simpler, to keep moving, keep noticing, keep creating, until my life felt full again. And so, I raised my glass of water that night, alone at my kitchen table, and whispered a toast, not to them, not to what I had lost, but to myself. To the woman who was learning, even now, that her story was far from over. By the time autumn deepened and the trees turned copper and gold, I had grown used to the silence between my son and me. It no longer startled me when days, then weeks, passed without his voice. At first, I counted them, each one like a tally mark on the wall of a prison I hadn't chosen. But eventually, I stopped marking. Time, like water, flowed whether I noticed or not. And in that flow, I began to find a strange rhythm of my own. I filled my mornings with small rituals, walking to the bakery for fresh bread, reading in the corner chair by the window, tending to the neglected plants on my porch. My afternoons became experiments in independence. I tried painting once, though the results were childish smears. I laughed at myself and kept the canvas anyway. I volunteered at the library on Wednesdays, shelving books and helping children find stories. Their little voices, bright with wonder, warmed places in me that had grown cold. But even as I built these new patterns, I could not deny the sting that surfaced at unexpected moments. At the grocery store, I once saw my son and his family in line ahead of me. They hadn't noticed me at first. His wife leaned over, showing him something on her phone, and I saw a picture flash across the screen. It was of the birthday dinner, everyone smiling, children holding balloons, the waiter's cake on the table. But I wasn't in it. Not even at the edge. They had cropped the photo so carefully it was as though I had never been there at all. I froze, the loaf of bread trembling in my hand. For a moment, I wanted to call out his name, to remind him I still existed. But then he glanced up and saw me. His eyes widened, guilt flickering across them like a shadow, but he said nothing. His wife turned, following his gaze, and her lips curved in that practiced polite smile that never reached her eyes. "Hello," she said lightly, as though we were strangers meeting in passing. My son added nothing. Not a word. I nodded, my throat too tight to answer, and placed the bread in my basket. They finished paying, gathered their bags, and left without a backward glance. I stood there for a long time after, the cashier waiting patiently, before I remembered to move again. That night, I could not sleep. I replayed the scene over and over, wondering how love could shrink so small, how a bond that once defined my life could reduce itself to silence in a supermarket aisle. And yet, in that sleeplessness, I also felt something hardening in me, not bitterness, exactly, but a kind of boundary. If they wished to erase me, I would not beg to be written back in. Instead, I would write myself elsewhere. The next morning, I made a decision. I signed up for a photography class at the community center. It was advertised as beginner-friendly, capturing life through a lens. I hesitated at first. What business did I have, a woman in her 60s, sitting among younger people who probably had sleek new cameras and nimble hands? But then I remembered the joy I had felt taking photos of the lake, of the market, of the little girl with the butterfly. Perhaps, I thought, this was my way forward. The first class was small, 6 of us gathered in a drafty room that smelled faintly of paint thinner. The instructor, a man with gentle eyes and a shock of gray hair, encouraged us to see not just what was in front of us, but what lay beneath it. A photograph, he said, isn't about perfection. It's about noticing. About saying, this moment mattered. His words landed in me like a soft bell. This moment mattered. Perhaps that was what I had been trying to remind myself all along. Over the weeks, I grew bolder. I learned about light, about framing, about how even the smallest detail could tell a story. I took photos of wrinkled apples at the market, of raindrops trembling on the edge of a leaf, of an old couple holding hands as they crossed the street. Each picture became a thread, weaving a new tapestry of meaning. And with every click, I felt less erased. There was a man in the class, too, who often lingered afterward to chat. His name was David, widowed like me, with kind wrinkles around his eyes. He spoke about his late wife with such tenderness it made me ache, but also gave me hope that love, once lived, never truly died. We shared stories over coffee, sometimes walking together after class. It wasn't romance, not then. It was companionship. A reminder that I was not alone in rebuilding a life from fragments. One evening, after a particularly heavy rain, I wandered the neighborhood with my camera. The streets shone like glass, reflecting the lamps in puddles. Children splashed in their boots, mothers called them in, and somewhere, a dog barked happily. I raised my camera and snapped one photo after another, feeling almost giddy with the simple act of capturing beauty. When I returned home, soaked but smiling, I realized I hadn't thought of my son or his wife for hours. That, too, was a kind of freedom. Still, the past tugged at me. On Sundays, when families gathered, I felt the ache of absence most keenly. I missed the laughter of my grandchildren, the way they once climbed onto my lap with sticky hands and wide eyes. I missed hearing my son's voice, even when it carried only the mundane details of his day. I missed belonging. One Sunday, unable to bear the silence, I baked a batch of chocolate chip cookies and walked to the park where I knew my son sometimes took the children. I told myself I was just going for a stroll, camera in hand, but my heart betrayed me. It hoped for an encounter. And indeed, I saw them there, the children running across the grass, his wife seated on a blanket, my son tossing a ball back and forth. For a moment, I stood hidden by the trees, watching, the cookies warm in my bag. But then I remembered the grocery store. I remembered the cropped photos. And I realized with painful clarity that my presence would not be welcomed. Slowly, I turned back, walking away before they could see me. The cookies grew cold in the bag, untouched, but I later gave them to the neighbors' children, who devoured them with joy. Their laughter was enough. That evening, I sat at my table, scarf wrapped around my shoulders, and thought, perhaps belonging is not always given. Perhaps, sometimes, it must be created. So I began inviting others into my life. I hosted small gatherings, just tea with the women from book club, or soup with a neighbor. My kitchen filled again with voices, with laughter, with the warmth of human presence. It wasn't the same as family, but it was something. Something real. David, the man from photography class, began to stop by more often. He would bring me prints of his photos, and we would sit together comparing shots, teasing each other about missed angles or blurry focus. Once, he brought me a single red rose, saying his wife used to love them, and he thought I might too. I placed it in a vase on the mantel, beside the unopened card from my son. For a long while, I stared at the two side by side, the rose, vibrant and alive, and the card, sealed and silent. And I thought about which one brought me comfort. As winter approached, the days grew shorter, the nights longer. I found myself reflecting more often on the journey I had begun since that dinner at the steakhouse. Pain had been the spark, yes, but it had also been the push I needed. Without those words, no photos with her, I might still be waiting for invitations that never came, still shrinking to fit into a story that had no room for me. Instead, I was learning to expand, to stretch, to claim space of my own. One snowy evening, after a walk with my camera, I sat by the window, watching the flakes swirl like feathers. My house was warm, the lamps casting golden pools of light. For the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. Not the peace of being accepted by others, but the peace of accepting myself. I poured a glass of wine, raised it gently, and whispered into the quiet, "Here's to the photos I will take, the memories I will keep, and the life that is mine." And as the snow fell softly outside, I realized that while I might never again appear in their pictures, I was building an album of my own, one filled not with erasure, but with presence. Winter eased its grip slowly, as if reluctant to let go. The ice on the sidewalks turned to slush, the trees wore a thin veil of frost in the mornings, and then, little by little, buds appeared on branches, soft green against gray skies. I found myself noticing these changes more than I had in years. Perhaps because I had learned to walk slower, to see with intention. Every morning, I carried my camera, capturing the fragile signs of spring. By then, months had passed since the steakhouse dinner. My son's silence remained steady, a wall built of avoidance and shame. Sometimes I imagined what might happen if he simply called, if his voice broke the quiet and said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I should have stood up for you." The fantasy was sweet but dangerous. Each time I indulged it, reality hurt more. And so, I trained myself to stop waiting. But the heart is not an obedient student. It remembers what it wants. One Sunday morning, I was in the park again, photographing the early crocuses pushing through the damp soil, when I heard a familiar sound, my grandson's laughter. I froze. I knew that laugh, bright and unguarded, like bells ringing. I turned, and there they were, my son, his wife, the children, gathered near the pond. My grandson was chasing ducks, his little sister clutching a stuffed rabbit. For a long moment, I watched from a distance. My instinct was to walk away, as I had before. To protect myself. But this time, something in me shifted. Perhaps it was the sunlight glinting off the water, or the memory of that child's arms around my neck years ago. Perhaps it was simply that I was tired of disappearing. Whatever the reason, I found myself walking toward them, each step steady, though my heart thudded. My grandson saw me first. His face lit up, and he ran forward, shouting, "Grandma." He threw himself against me, and I caught him, holding him close. His small body smelled of grass and earth. My granddaughter followed, shy at first, but then she smiled and pressed the rabbit into my hand. And then, silence. My son stood a few feet away, his wife beside him, her expression unreadable. He looked at me, then at the children clinging to me, and I saw the struggle in his eyes. Shame. Love. Confusion. "Hello," I said, my voice calm, though inside I trembled. "It's good to see you." My son opened his mouth, but before he could speak, his wife stepped forward. "We didn't know you'd be here," she said flatly, as though my presence were an intrusion. "No," I replied softly. "You didn't." The children tugged at my hand, asking if I would walk with them. For a moment, everything hung in the balance. My son could have spoken then. He could have bridged the gap. But he didn't. He simply looked away, his silence heavy as stone. So I knelt, kissed each child's head, and said gently, "I have to go now. But I love you very much." I handed the rabbit back to my granddaughter, who frowned, confused, but didn't protest. Then I stood, nodded once more, and walked away. I did not cry until I reached home. And when I did, it was not the sharp sting of earlier grief but something deeper, something final. The encounter had confirmed what I had long feared, that my son would not choose me. Not over her. Not even alongside her. But strangely, after the tears, I felt a calm resolve. The ache remained, but it no longer hollowed me out. Instead, it solidified into a truth I could not ignore. I had been trying to plant myself in soil that no longer wanted me. And it was time, past time, to root myself elsewhere. That evening, I lit a candle and sat with the photo albums spread before me. I sifted through them slowly, choosing images to keep and others to let go. It was not erasure, but release. I placed a few cherished photos, my son's childhood smile, the children's first birthdays, into a small box. The rest, I tucked away in a chest, no longer demanding they be part of my daily life. And then, I did something that surprised even me. I began a new album. An empty one, pages crisp and clean. Into it, I placed my recent photographs, the market sunflowers, the snowlit streets, the crocuses breaking through the earth. It felt like stitching together a new story, one that was mine alone. Over the weeks that followed, I leaned more fully into this new life. I joined a local photography group that met on Saturdays, and we took trips together to capture landscapes. David often accompanied me, his quiet presence a comfort. We shared sandwiches on park benches, compared lenses, laughed over botched exposures. Slowly, I began to trust that connection again, not as a replacement for family, but as proof that companionship could still grow in unlikely soil. One afternoon, after a group outing, David walked me home. On the porch, he hesitated, then said, "You know, you've changed since I first met you." "Changed how?" I asked, adjusting the scarf around my shoulders. "You carry yourself differently. Lighter. As if you've finally remembered you matter." His words caught me off guard. For a moment, I could only look at him, the weight of all these months pressing behind my eyes. And then I smiled, small but real. Maybe I finally have. That night, I stood at the kitchen sink, washing dishes, and thought about what he'd said. Remembered I matter. It seemed such a simple thing, yet I realized how long I had forgotten it. I had measured my worth by invitations withheld, by photographs denied. But worth was not something given or taken. It was something I had to hold, stubbornly, even when others tried to diminish it. Spring unfolded. The days grew longer, the air warmer. I planted herbs in pots on the porch, their green shoots filling the air with fresh scent. I photographed them daily, amused by how quickly they grew. And one afternoon, as I sat in the sun with a book, I realized that I had not thought about the steakhouse dinner in days. The memory was still there, sharp and painful, but it no longer defined me. The turning point came quietly, as many do. I was walking through the market when a woman from book club stopped me. "I saw your photos online," she said. "They're beautiful. You have such an eye for detail." She asked if I would contribute a few to the community newsletter. I agreed, though my hands shook with nervousness. When the issue was printed, seeing my work there, my perspective, my moments, was a revelation. I was in the picture after all. Perhaps not theirs, but mine. And so, when the next Sunday came, I did not sit by the phone waiting. Instead, I packed a small bag, drove out to the lake, and spent the afternoon photographing the shifting light on the water. I ate a sandwich alone, drank tea from a flask, and felt at peace. The silence was no longer a void but a space I could fill myself. That evening, as dusk fell, I poured a glass of wine and raised it high. Not to anyone else this time. Just to me. To the woman who had endured exclusion, who had grieved, who had found her way through. And for the first time since that dinner, I whispered words that no longer carried bitterness but quiet strength. "No photos with her?" "Fine. I'll take my own." By summer, the sharp edges of that night at the steakhouse had worn down, though the memory never vanished. It lingered like an old scar, no longer raw, but still tender if pressed. Sometimes, while brushing my hair in the mirror, I would hear the words again, "No photos with her." They no longer made me flinch. Instead, they reminded me of where I had been, and how far I had come. My life had grown fuller in ways I hadn't expected. The photography group had become a circle of friends. Our Saturday excursions now carried laughter, shared sandwiches, and the easy comfort of belonging. My book club continued, too, and I found myself hosting more often, my kitchen table crowded with mugs and half-finished conversations that spilled into the evening. The empty house, once oppressive, had grown warm again, layered with voices and stories. And David. His presence had woven itself gently into my days. He never pressed, never demanded. He simply appeared, sometimes with a rose, sometimes with a new camera tip, sometimes with silence that was as companionable as any words. We walked often, and once, while sitting on a bench at dusk, he reached for my hand. I let him take it, the gesture so natural it startled me with its simplicity. In that moment, I realized I had stopped looking over my shoulder for what was absent and begun noticing what was present. Still, there were reminders. At the grocery store, I sometimes caught sight of my son's wife, brisk and polished, steering her cart past as though I were invisible. Occasionally, I glimpsed my grandchildren from afar, taller now, their faces stretching toward adolescence. Each time, a pang pierced me. Love does not dissolve simply because it is unwelcome. But I no longer chased it. I let the pang come, and then I let it go. One afternoon, while tending to my porch herbs, I found the unopened birthday card from my son still resting on the mantel where I had left it months before. I held it in my hands, weighing it, debating. Part of me wanted to open it at last, to see if perhaps there was an apology inside, or even a simple, thoughtless greeting. But another part of me resisted. Did I need to know? Would it change anything? I sat at the kitchen table, turning it over and over, until finally I slipped it into a drawer. Not discarded, but not read either. Some things, I decided, can remain mysteries. Closure doesn't always come in neat sentences written in ink. Sometimes it is simply choosing to stop asking. The months stretched on. My photographs began to find small recognition, first the community newsletter, then a local cafe that hung a few prints on its walls. Strangers complimented them, some even purchased one or two. I never imagined such a thing, that my eye could bring someone else joy. And each time I saw one of my photos displayed, I thought, I am in the picture after all. I always was. On the anniversary of that birthday dinner, I made a quiet ritual for myself. Instead of waiting for an invitation, I reserved a table at the very same steakhouse. I went alone. The waiter, perhaps new, didn't recognize me, but he treated me kindly, refilling my glass with care. I ordered what I wanted, lingered over dessert, and when he asked if I would like a photo, I said yes. He snapped it with my own camera, my scarf draped across my shoulders, my glass raised. Later, when I looked at it, I didn't see loneliness. I saw a woman who had chosen herself. A woman who had learned, painfully, that family is not always where you expect it to be, but who had found a way to keep living anyway. When I placed that photo in my album, I paused, running my hand over the smooth page. And then I wrote beneath it in careful script, the night I remembered I belonged to myself. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that. I still longed, at times, for my son's voice, for my grandchildren's arms around my neck. That ache never disappeared. But it softened, became something I could carry without breaking. And in its place, other joys had taken root: friendship, art, quiet love, the small daily wonders of living. One evening, sitting on the porch with David, the sky washed in lavender and gold, he asked me if I regretted it, any of it. The pain, the loss, the exclusion. I thought for a long time before answering. I regret what was taken, I said softly. I regret that love turned into silence. But I don't regret what I've built since. I don't regret learning that I can still choose joy, even when others do not choose me. He nodded, squeezing my hand, and we sat in silence as the stars appeared one by one. In the end, that is the truth I carry now, that our lives are not defined only by who holds us close, but also by what we choose to hold when we are left standing alone. So when I raise my glass these days, it is not in bitterness or defiance, but in gratitude, for the mornings I still wake, for the laughter of friends, for the beauty waiting to be noticed. And though my son's wife once murmured those words like a sentence, no photos with her, I have learned that the truest photos are not the ones others take, but the ones we create ourselves, frame by frame, moment by moment, proof that we were here. And I was here. I am still here. And that is enough.